Toward that end, I want to invite Professor Kalok, who I met, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. He is now the Dean of Business School at Chinese University, one of the top universities here in Hong Kong. The business school has a strategic advantage because it's right in the MTR station, right? As opposed to the other side of the university. So many students want to go Chinese U and said, I'm going to stop here because that's the nearest that I can go. So that's that. He has a finance background, so that's good for us. And on top of being the dean, he's also trying to do some new things and exciting things. So that's an important point. It is our pleasure to invite him. He's also going to chair with Robyn tomorrow's research session on Friday morning. So Kalok, with your permission, please.
Thank you, Yasha, for your nice introduction. And I should also mention another advantage of Chinese U is that we are really very close to the science park. Science park, I mean, that is another place for really that the research and technology and innovation, just like that what this cyberport is trying to do, is doing. So I'm very glad to be invited because actually, as Yasha mentioned, my discipline is finance. And that's nothing to do with the innovation. In fact, my finance is not even to do with the venture capital. So why am I here, right? Well, because I've tried to learn, and as Yasha mentioned that now that as the dean of the business school, I try to do something. I hope there's something exciting and something very valuable. But of course, I'm really looking at this entrepreneurship and innovation and see how that I can really bring it back for the University for Business School. So I'm very glad to be invited, and that so that give me the opportunity to really to listen all this remarkable discussion. And so of course that here this session we are about the role of the government in this venture. I think this is very timely for Hong Kong because that. As Yasha mentioned, today is probably a very big day for Hong Kong because that we will probably have a innovation and technology bureau to be set up because that now tonight, LASHCO is going to discuss, and once that they approve, and then probably in 2 weeks' time, then we will have the bureau, and of course that our morning keynote speaker, Nick Yang. Supposedly he's supposed to deliver, I mean that he is going to head the bureau based on all the public knowledge. I don't have inside information, but it's all public information that he is going to head the bureau, and so therefore that, and then he will probably have to think about that. What will be the role of the government in promoting the innovation and the venture for Hong Kong, and what kind of policy that we should have. And of course, this is going to be very interesting because that what exactly the role of Hong Kong or the government in general, right, in the promoting this venture. And I think that is a lot of different schools of thought. I mean, some might say that, well, the government should not really do too much. In fact, that Hong Kong has to be like that because Hong Kong has always been proud of the free economy, and then let the market really figure out the best, and government should not really intervene. And that, but of course, that now that this line of thinking has changed, so now that's why that the government decided that, well, I need to have a positive intervention, and then that's why they set up the bureau, and then really try to promote this venture. So we are very grateful that we have 2 experts in this area, and that. The first speaker, in fact, is a major speaker, keynote speaker, is Dr. Robyn Klingler Vidra from King's College. And that Robyn, actually that before she joined King's College, she was with Kalok Institute, so probably working with Yasha, and that she got her PhD from LSE, and that her research area really focused on exactly the role of the government policy in building venture capital markets. And then the other speaker, who is a responder, Marta Dowejko, okay, see here. In fact, it's my colleague at Chinese U. She's and that she's now with our Center of Entrepreneurship, which is also in our business school, and then she's really the postdoc fellow there, and that she obtained her PhD from the University of Hong Kong, and that so her research area mainly on this entrepreneurial network and strategic entrepreneurship, and also that she had really looked at this Hong Kong ecosystem. In fact, that she's going to really have a small sharing with us on this Hong Kong ecosystem. But without further ado, let me invite Robyn, and then to come up, she's going to talk about the venture policy. Okay, Robyn.
Thank you, Professor Chan. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I have the distinct pleasure of having the graveyard shift, the post-lunch talk. So I'm going to do my best to keep it interactive, especially for those of you with jet lag. I want to make sure that we're awake. So I want to start with the premise that Professor Chan mentioned, which is that governments shouldn't do much in this regard, right? Governments should let the free markets act. So can I just take a sort of straw poll, raise your hand, who thinks governments should stay out of startups and venture? Yes. And then those who strongly believe that, Marta, yeah, who strongly believe that governments have to act. Governments have a lot to do. Okay. But I think that's right. And I think increasingly that's the way things are. My instinct is that if I asked the same question to an audience like this 10 years ago, the answer would have been, especially in Hong Kong, would have been more the former, right? Governments should stay out of the market activities. Governments should stay out of startups. Governments shouldn't meddle. And so this gets to what I want to start with as the premise, right? So there's these two sort of universal truths. One, the governments can't pick winners, right? The governments should not select winning companies, winning industries. Governments can't pick market winners, so they shouldn't do that. The other side of the coin, the other truth, is what a lot of you have attested to as well, is that governments have to act, right? Governments need to enable an environment where startup ecosystems can flourish. Now, it's really interesting doing this talk in Hong Kong. This is also one of the countries that I did my PhD research on. But Hong Kong has, of course, been ranked at the top of the Heritage Economic Freedom Index for the better part of 20 years. Right? So this neoliberal state, this laissez-faire approach is the idea. I actually don't agree with that entirely. I actually think that by the 1990s, the government here said that doesn't work when it comes to supporting venture. We have to act. We have to do something. So the question then becomes, if even neoliberal states, if even Hong Kong, and I would also argue that the US and Silicon Valley, if they're not leaving startup ecosystems to market forces, what are they doing, right? Especially in an era where we have less money, we have less government money for supporting venture, how do governments intelligently, effectively support venture? I want to give a quote as well before I move on by Karl Polanyi, a famous economist, who has a provocative approach to this idea of the free market. He said the free market was opened and has been held open by the state, by the government. It always has. This idea that the free market can evolve and can flourish without government policy, without intervention, is false. The entire premise is false. It would be interesting to talk through that more. So governments want to create startup ecosystems, ideally startup ecosystems that maybe don't copy the Silicon Valley model, but have the same success, perhaps. And as Yesha opened today's talks with, we want to support ecosystems that are going to drive innovation and are going to drive job growth. So this is a recent chart from CB Insights. And if you aren't already a follower or a recipient of the CB Insights newsletter, I highly recommend joining. Their data and also their writing style is absolutely fantastic. So this is a recent infographic they put together of the massive sort of inflation of unicorns, right? Of course, a unicorn is a company that gets $1 billion valuation, and it used to be a mythical idea. Now it's an everyday occurrence, as this shows. So the idea, especially if you talk to policymakers, we want to support innovation. We want to support ecosystems that are going to produce jobs, innovation, and ideally, a few unicorns, right? A few companies that are worth $1 billion. In light of this, we want to help. We want to drive startup ecosystems. So this is my research of looking at when governments launched fund of venture capital funds. That's what this cumulative chart is showing. And in my research, I found that at least over 40 countries have launched funds of venture capital funds on a national level with the intention of growing venture capital markets, with the intention of supporting startups. So I have seen this trend that's, we see this ubiquity that supporting venture capital as a means of supporting innovation and startup ecosystems is happening globally. Okay, so on one hand, we know that we want to support startup ecosystems. We want to drive, ideally, unicorns. Everyone's doing it. But the story doesn't end there. And that's what I want to focus my talk on now. There's incredible diversity in how governments and municipalities, regional governments, have tried and have successfully started ecosystems and have made an impact in this regard. So I just want to highlight three varieties or three recent attempts at promoting venture. So one, Startup Jamaica, which has the wonderful catchphrase of "Get Up, Startup." Right, so you can hear Bob Marley as you read through their materials. They've effectively adapted or perhaps copied with a few changes Startup Chile, right, which has been hugely effective in supporting domestic entrepreneurship in Santiago in Chile, but doing that by attracting entrepreneurs from all over the world. So a government-run accelerator in Chile initially, and now the Jamaicans, with the help of the World Bank, have done something similar. So accelerators are one way that we've seen supports of startup ecosystems. Does anyone hold Estonian e-residency? Have you thought about it? So I don't yet, but my Twitter feed has been full of people gloating that they're now Estonian residents as well. So Estonia launched something really interesting recently where they said, okay, we're a small country. How are we ever going to grow our population? How are we going to attract business? How are we going to have a bigger presence in this regard? And they created a program where anyone in the world can apply for, and if approved, hold e-residency, which means that then you can launch your business, you can live your life through the Estonian government paradigm, if you will. So this is moving beyond land borders, moving beyond the traditional idea of the state, which I think is a hugely innovative government program. Last but not least of these, the Vietnamese government, years ago actually, has implemented programming into the national curriculum. Right? So there's a famous visit that a senior Google engineer did to Vietnam a few years ago, where someone had asked him upon leaving Vietnam, what did you think of what you've seen here? And he said, I think that Vietnam is well ahead of where the US is in terms of what they're teaching their kids in terms of the ability to advance in computer science. Interestingly, we, meaning the UK, even though I don't have a British accent yet, I don't think I ever will, In the UK, we just launched the similar computer science curriculum that Vietnam did years ago. We just launched it in 2014. So interesting to think about the notions of who's learning from whom. Okay. Incidentally, Vietnam has the world's largest Intel facility, a $1 billion facility outside of Ho Chi Minh City. Okay, so everyone's acting, different approaches to how to support venture, even amongst peers, even amongst similar countries, right? So in this slide, I show that we have the VC policies to promote venture capital in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. Similar instruments, but with very much different emphasis and different aims. So let's just look, and massive difference in the amount of money that's given. Okay, so I'll just look at the Fund of Venture Capital fund line. Right, so the Hong Kong government in 1994, through the Applied Research Fund, gave money to 4 venture capital managers and said, go out and invest in startups on our behalf, right, and gave $100 million. In Taiwan, really interesting what Volker was saying this morning, actually, that the NDF launched a significant fund last year. Their first proper foray into the fund-to-fund model was a bilateral effort with New Zealand, but also they had the NDF, the National Development Fund, investing in startups since the mid-'80s. Now in Singapore, this idea of investing in VC came onto the radar in '99, and they launched the Technopreneurship Investment Fund with $1 billion. So let's just take a step back. $1 billion investing in tech with the fund launched in the year 2000. Any ideas about the timing or the results of that? Not ideal timing, right? So the TIF, the Technopreneurship Investment Fund, was wound down, of course, a few years later. But that didn't stop them. The Singaporean government has invested in an early stage venture fund now for 2 rounds in recent years, where they're looking more at direct investments. So I could get into the sort of gory details of the different funds, but I'll spare you. But my point is that we've seen quite different levels of funding, quite different approaches to how to support venture, even in looking at this one particular type of model. Okay, so in the article that I published in the first issue of Venture Findings, actually, I look at this policy menu, right? So what are the 44 different tools? And we came to 44 because that's, mapping out the entire universe of what governments have and could do. This is what we came up with. And those 44 different policies are contained within these eight areas. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this, and I hope that this will be interesting context, Marta, for your talk about Hong Kong specifically. Okay, so primarily, or the first, we think about government giving money to support venture, right? So, and there's different ways of doing this. As I highlighted in the last slide, we have government funding, government VC funds, government funds of funds. We have government loans, guarantees, grant competitions, etc. It's also important, the last category here is public R&D expenditure, right? So the government spending money on research and development, as well as, of course, a means of supporting venture. Taxation, low tax, no tax, tax rebates. Regulation. This is a hugely important category that I think is often overlooked. I was speaking during the break about, actually with Volker, about venture in Japan. And one example that comes up of sort of what to change and to have a material impact in a positive way on a venture ecosystem comes from Japan. So the bankruptcy laws in Japan until the period between 2000 and 2002 were incredibly punitive. If you launched a company and it didn't work and you wanted to wind it down, it was very, very hard to do so. It was very hard to kill a company, and to move on with your life. So we ended up with these zombie companies in Japan. So this has an important effect on the culture as well, because instead of, so in Silicon Valley, if you've had a startup, it's failed, and you go to start your next one, you're an experienced entrepreneur, right? In Japan, you're stuck with a zombie company forever, right? It's a failure that you're stuck with. So regulation really matters. And even policies and laws that can look very similar with certain changes in even well-intended ways can be hugely negative in how they're employed. So I think this is a really important one to watch. Interesting that we're sitting in cyberports and thinking about the proximity to the science park, right? The importance of clusters, networks, and institutes, and drawing on the positive impacts that come from, frankly, being close, right? It's replicating the Silicon Valley idea in Hsinchu Park in Taiwan of if service providers, if investors and entrepreneurs are close to universities and close to established companies, we have synergies coming out of this. And increasingly we see governments making huge investments and strives in this particular category. And as we say, attracting talent as well. I was in the other room with my research assistant earlier, but I heard the comment about the number, or the presentation that was given on the percent of startup founders in Silicon Valley who are foreigners, right? So attracting the best global talent is massively important. And these entrepreneur visas are becoming more and more common the world over. And as I mentioned, Startup Chile has been a really tremendous program in that regard. If you haven't been to Chile and you're interested in starting a company, and just in case you haven't heard what the Startup Chile program is, effectively the government gives $50,000, $40,000 or $50,000 for coming to Chile to try to build a business for a year. No strings attached, except you have to hang out in Santiago a lot. But this is it. So it's not in return for any share of equity of the business that you create. The government just simply gives a decent amount of money. Now, the interesting thing about this is that $50,000 times a small number of the people that receive it, in government terms, is a tiny, tiny amount of money, right? The Chilean government has invested a very small amount of money in this program, but it quite literally put Chile on the world map of places that you might consider going to if you want to start a company. I guarantee before they launched their first program in 2010 that none of us would have thought, I want to start a business, I'm moving to Santiago. So these can have a real impact in a short period of time as well. Another category of government policies, technology infrastructure and government procurement, right? So using the government coffers, using government money to invest into companies, either startups that are launching businesses or those around it. In the UK, we have a really interesting like open data initiative, which is attempting to offer startups a huge amount of opportunity to play with data in different arenas. I told you it was the graveyard shift. Okay, and stock market access. Yeah. And Manny, you had mentioned this in your talk as well, is launching a stock market as a means of having an exit channel for startups. Right. So there's been JASDAQ in Japan. Singapore has Catalyst, launching a local capital market specific for early stage or small companies to access capital. Last but not least, education and training. So in this one, I love the Vietnam example. The changing the national curriculum so that 4th and 5th graders are taught relevant computer programs, I think is fantastic. And there's been increasing efforts in improving technology transfer, accelerators, incubators attached to universities, et cetera, and entrepreneurship centers in and out of universities. Okay, last slide. And I hope that mapping out the policies of what we can do is interesting to think about when we, in the next presentation that Marta will give, thinking about, okay, well, if this is the environment today, right, if this is the context for Hong Kong or elsewhere, what can you do? Right? I run a lot of sessions with executives where I say, okay, let's imagine that you're the chief czar of technology of your country. Right? You're the head of innovation, which is going to, sounds like, be a real thing in Hong Kong very soon. What do you do? Right? So these are the policies that you can think about being within your wheelhouse. So how to implement these various policies, these 8 categories of policies, how to implement them well. Right? So first, have a long time horizon. So in the case that I gave of the Singaporean fund, a venture capital fund with $1 billion under management, it was wound down in 2004, one, because the timing had been horrendous, but also if you think about it, if you're investing in venture capital and you give 5 years before you decide to wind down, it's just an unfair time frame, right? It's not possible you're going to give the full run of the fund to work. You at least need to give 10 years. But and this also happened in Hong Kong with the ARF was wound down 5-6 years after its launch. Right? So we need to have patience. We need to have a long time horizon and understanding that building, supporting venture takes time. Right? And to do that, you also have to have a certain risk appetite, which is challenging for governments as well, right? To say, we're going to put this money, these resources. Yes, it may not work. Yes, we may not have tangible metrics or KPIs, but we're willing to incur that risk. As Volker mentioned earlier, and as many increasingly say, Silicon Valley can't be copied. So build on local advantages, right? Focus on the local market. There's an initiative in Malaysia where they're trying to make a certain parts of Malaysia, they are saying they want it to be the Detroit of Asia. And I hope they mean that in the nicest of ways. I went to university near Detroit, and I don't know that I'd want to replicate Detroit, but they want to be the auto services, auto components parts of Asia. And so they have a really clear idea, and my hope is that it's focused on their local advantages and what exists already. Co-investing with private sector is essential, making sure that there's market relevance, that there's commercialization abilities. Right, and then on the flip side of these, it's the things to avoid, right? So over-engineering support and being too dogmatic and too prescriptive in what venture is going to be. And obviously the tension here is real, right? So governments need to support and to help and to direct and to launch initiatives and accelerators, et cetera, but need to do it in a sort of horizontally open type of way, right? Which there's a lot of initiatives that don't necessarily do this, but are broad enough, right? So investing in green technologies, let's say, and I know the Science Park has focuses, for example, where they're interested in green, invest in biotech, et cetera. So trying to be somewhat focused without over-engineering. The second one, if everyone could get right, I'm sure that they would, but the idea of trying not to invest solely in things that would never have commercial relevance or ability, which is a challenge, right? Because that's also what governments do. They're willing to undertake the risk and the blue sky thinking, the blue sky research that the private sector typically does not. Last but not least, I argue to not give away your tax proceeds so quickly, right? If there's other things that governments can do that can change education and do things that don't mean taking a major hit in tax revenue, This is a way of supporting venture ecosystems without it coming at the cost of governments running with the money that they need to run, frankly. Okay, I close there. And Professor Chan, I don't know if you want to come and chair and switch to Marta, or?
Yeah, maybe we can let Marta.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. And so I think there's a lot of advice, and this is a good recipe for the Hong Kong government to think when that they have this bureau. I mean, I especially interested in the last point, not to consider tax revenues unnecessary, because Hong Kong is already very low tax, and how much more that they can really concede. But now that we're good to have Marta to really to share with us about the current status of Hong Kong, I mean the Hong Kong ecosystem, and so that we know how that we can really proceed further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, thanks. Thank you. All right. Okay. Here you go. I will be talking about Hong Kong. I would like to thank Robyn very much for her presentation, for outlining all the things that the government can do or should not do to help startups. I will be using Hong Kong as a case study to show you what elements work, how they work, and how they might impact the ecosystem. This is a piece of research that we've completed this year within the Center for Entrepreneurship at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and we have studied the Hong Kong startup ecosystem extensively. So we went through the history, geography, policy, all the elements that we've been covered so far today. And so here, what you see is the result of what we have discovered. Well, so these are the categories that Robyn defined, right? For policy, what the government can do to help startups. And in terms of Hong Kong, well, the fields that are highlighted in green, these are the things that we all consider that Hong Kong is doing right for startups, right? So the taxes are low. There is no gain tax and so on. So these are the things that we think are very, very good to start a business in Hong Kong. And also in terms of regulation, where there are some issues that are being tackled right now, for example, in terms of fintech industry. But in general, comparing to other economies, Hong Kong is doing very well. Stock markets, we have a GEM board, which is the Growth Enterprise Board, which is the second board on Hong Kong Stock Exchange, which also has a great potential for startups in terms of going IPO quicker and easier than on other markets. And in terms of infrastructure, well, I don't know how many of you traveled on an MTR, but if you look around, when people travel, they don't look at each other anymore. They just look on their smartphones. So infrastructure can be considered pretty good. And one thing that comes out of it is it's exactly that. So the infrastructure and the rule of law and the taxation makes Hong Kong a very interesting and very good place to start a business. And in fact, Hong Kong has been ranked in doing business reports very, very high for years, and been considered as a very good economy to start a business. But considering that, so here you have a chart that compares Hong Kong to China, Singapore, and South Korea. As you can see, everything is pretty much covered. And but this is not enough. This is not enough because when you look at the startup rates in Hong Kong, they are actually not that high. Well, this is actually an image of the startup ecosystem back in 2009. So when the entire economy, all the startups in Hong Kong started to develop. And at that time, only 6.5% of the adult population in Hong Kong was engaging in entrepreneurial activities, which is very low considering that the average for innovation-driven economies was double. Okay, so as you can see, covering just parts of the policy, this is not enough. And funny you mentioned Detroit, because some of you were in our workshop in January, where we actually look into what kind of changes we could make in the policy and what different stakeholders could do for the ecosystem in Hong Kong. And this is that was one of the quotes that we had from the workshop, where people were saying, well, we have to do something about Hong Kong because we don't want to be the Detroit. If we don't do anything right now, in 20 years' time, we'll be the new Detroit. So it's funny that you mentioned it, like they want to be what Hong Kong doesn't. So covering just a part of those, some of the policy elements is not enough. And so the ecosystem started to develop right after the latest financial crisis, worldwide crisis, so around 2008, 2009. And these the yellow highlighted elements were the main focus of development in the ecosystem. So I just have few examples for you what has been done and what are the effects right now on the economy. So in terms of clusters and networks, we saw a 10-time growth in the number of co-working spaces in Hong Kong in the past 5 to 6 years. We started back in 2008. We started with one co-working space. Right now, we have more than 40. So you can see that there's lots of growth and encouragement from the government to start hubs and networks for startups. Also, this year, the government scrapped one of its key research and development programs for startup companies, and transformed it into the ESS, which is the Entrepreneurship Support Fund. And one of the things that happened is that before the ESS was implemented, the companies were actually asked to repay the loan to the government. Right now, it's not the case anymore, which is a great way of which is a big improvement comparing to what was happening before. In terms of importing talents, we have new visas. We have a returnee visa. So this is for second-generation Hong Kong permanent residents who can right now apply for visas and come back to Hong Kong. And they start to come. They start to come back to Hong Kong to start their businesses. We also implemented the startup visas, which is very much modeled on the Canadian model, where if a company is associated with one of the incubation government-run incubation programs, they are granted a visa to start a business in Hong Kong. In terms of education, there are lots of new programs that are being developed as well. The TSSSU, it's the Technology Startup Support Scheme for Universities. We call it TSSU, which is not to wipe out the innovation, but to kind of provide the fabric to develop the whole ecosystem. This is a new program that the government implemented for 6 universities, where they receive 4 million Hong Kong dollars per year to invest in startups that are developed within universities. So this is a way of commercializing the research and development coming out of universities. Also, we have a very efficient government agency, Invest Hong Kong, that started the Start Me Up Hong Kong festival, and they've been promoting extensively startup activities across the entire ecosystem. So what all these things did, and it's just for in terms of the growth in interest in Hong Kong startup ecosystem, you can see these two arrows at the bottom. So these are the statistics that I pull out from AngelList. So in terms of the number of business angels that were registered on AngelList last year, they were around 250. Right now it's around 500. And in terms of the investors that are interested in investing in Hong Kong startups, the number went from 2,600 something to more than 13,000 of individuals who are interested in investing in Hong Kong. So you can see that these activities, although these look like pretty standard things, they actually do a lot of work for the ecosystem to develop. Robyn was talking about it as a first element. I'm keeping it for last, the funding. Why? It's because very often we concentrate on how much money the government should put into research and development, but we like to look at it from a different perspective. It's actually about balancing of how much money the government puts versus how much money the industry invests into developing the ecosystem. And if things are out of balance, this is exactly what happens. So, and this is what we've looked into in Hong Kong. So this is what we call the vicious circle of crouching innovation, and this basically is to show you how the imbalance in how research and development money is spent impacts innovation in the economy. I won't really go into great details here. It's just to show you that if like in case of Hong Kong, where the match is more or less dollar per dollar, so $1 invested by the government, $1 invested by the industry, this kind of creates this imbalance where the entire ecosystem becomes actually dependent on the government, and it's not pushing the innovation. Is not coming from the bottom, but it's expected from the top. But there's a way of jailbreaking from it, and this is I won't go into details again, but it's just to show you that there are actually some activities right now going on in Hong Kong that are already targeting this vicious circle of non-innovation. Like, for example, we have programs that are liaising universities with corporations. For instance, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, we have a program called Empowering Young Entrepreneurs, where we work together with Google and with KPMG to develop startups and to mentor them through the process. And this is very, very much supported by government. So to what Robyn said, I would add a ninth element. Yes. Oh. I will add the ninth element, which is about the balancing of the 5 stakeholders groups, and this is how things are recommended. How the 5 groups of mentors, feeders, supporters, and brokers and leaders should be developed. But this is the current situation in Hong Kong, and Yesha put entrepreneurs at the bottom of his slide. I put them on the top because we believe that they are the leaders, and all the ecosystem should be built by entrepreneurs. The role of the government is the role of the supporter. So this is This is the this is why when excuse me. This is why when Robyn asked the question about whether the government should intervene or not, I said, well, it should support. So the balancing act of Hong Kong policy is such that changes should be gradual. The government should monitor the ecosystem and try to implement policies that maintain the balance between different stakeholder groups and create consistent and persistent change in the ecosystem. That is not rapid and thoughtless, but long-term. So thank you very much.